provocative conversations. And the panel that I'm bringing here now are very interesting people. Oh, forgot to introduce myself. My name is Hlengiwe Ndlovu. I lecture at the Wits School of Governance. And also consider myself as an activist on the ground. And the panel that I'm bringing here is, excuse me, on navigating complex relationship between governments, civil society, philanthropy, and private sector. And I believe these are important actors within the civil society space that are actually, act together, whether in opposition, whether in collaboration, whether in support of each other, or any other form of complexities that are at play. But today we are exploring a lot of issues, but including them dynamics of power, collaboration, influence, and other issues. I'm going to introduce all of them at once so that when they start speaking, I do not interrupt. I'm a sociologist by training, so I'm not generous with time. I know the previous panel, they had 15 minutes, and the reason why I'm not generous with time is because I want to open more space for engagement. I don't believe in my own voice alone as an activist, yes. So our first speaker will be joining us from online, and Mohsen, and he's a professor of political sociology from Ayat University, and some of his work centered around questions of religion and power. He will be joining us from online. Welcome, Prof. Our next speaker. Sorry. Am I still on? Okay. Okay, thanks. Our next speaker will be, Jacob might say he's not part of the panel. I don't know whether he chickened out or not. So our next speaker will be Audrey. I think I'll give preference to her. And she's from the Red Foundation, where they are advancing social justice. They believe in fair, just, and a democratic society because they believe that there is systemic violence that leads to an unjust society. So some of the work that they are doing, navigates that space. Welcome, Audrey. The next speaker will be Tendai, who comes from the Civil Institute. And they believe that they are not just philosophers, they think and do. So while they think about some of these challenges that are facing us in everyday society, they also, act on them. So they promote conversations that are based on evidence. The last speaker, but not least, will be Liberty Bebe, who comes from the Southern African Alliance Youth Employment. They deal with questions of decent work. This is in realization of the different forms of marginalization, especially in Africa, but we'll be focusing on, their work is most focused on Southern Africa, obviously with some links globally. So this panel will be entering into the conversation that is already in the space. There are already provocative questions that have already been thrown into the room. I don't know if they're going to be providing answers or they are going to be adding more puzzles to the conversations. And I will open the space for them. Thank you. Oh, okay. Okay, guys, that's technology. Ne? We're not yet there, not yet, but we are coming. Over to you, Prof. Okay, while we're waiting there, I will pass the mic on in the meantime, in the interest of time. Yes.
Morning, everyone. So I'm Audrey from the Wraith Foundation. I made a pact with my sister sitting next to me that I wouldn't do a PowerPoint, and also in the interests of time. Also because, to be very honest, multitasking with thinking and talking and technology is not my forte anymore. So I am from the Wraith Foundation, which is a South African philanthropy, private foundation, commonly called a donor, I think. I say that with some trepidation. So I'm only going to speak from that perspective. I have to say I've worked for Wraith for about 15 years, and so my understanding of philanthropy and my understanding of social justice philanthropy is really very much framed and couched by my experience at Wraith. I've put a presentation together based on questions that I hope to answer. May or may not be correct. So the first question I ask myself is, are philanthropic organizations such as mine, so private foundations, doing enough to fund social justice, democracy building, human rights work, whatever you want to call it? And I think the answer is a definite no. I don't base my conclusions on research. These are purely my observations over the last 15 years in South Africa. And I think the reasons why philanthropy in South Africa is not funding social justice work are complex, and they may be very similar to other African countries. Of course, South Africa has a particular recent history of apartheid, which definitely impacts on that. And also, yeah, I think it's a lot to do with the fact that in the new democratic space, many philanthropists that I've spoken to actually have said that they don't want to fund social justice work because it's seen as somehow anti-government, and they wanted to either be supportive of the new government or they were frightened to fund in this space because they had business interests with government. On the more conservative side, obviously a lot of philanthropic money in South Africa came out of that history of apartheid. People made money in that time, and are, I suppose, choosing my words carefully here, they are conservative. So funding social justice is seen as funding something that is political, maybe considered a little bit left-wing, maybe liberal to left-wing. But the fact is, in my experience anyway, there is no tangible threat to philanthropies in South Africa funding social justice. There have been no experiences in my mind, and I can give you some examples of more existential type threats that we've experienced, but there's no tangible threats. That's not to say that it is encouraged, that's probably a certainty. It's not encouraged. There are some limitations even for philanthropies like ours, in that, of course, in some aspects of the work that we fund, there can be illegal activities. They are probably perfectly legitimate in that, you know, people have no other option but to resort to illegal activities, but that makes it difficult for us then to fund them. And the reasons for that are what I'm going to go into. But I would say in general that philanthropic organizations are not doing enough in South Africa to fund social justice work because they are risk averse and politically conservative. These are huge generalizations, but that's what I think. What can be done about that? So, I mean, I've thought a lot about that as a philanthropy here, in that what can I do, what can we do to encourage others to do what we are doing? Because if we can do it, then everybody else can do it, huh? I think what we do a bad job of as NGOs in South Africa and as donors to social justice NGOs is monitoring and evaluation. It's an old story, but it's still a very important story. In that, and I would emphasize evaluation, because I think what we struggle with is to clearly articulate what are the results that we are achieving. We are certainly achieving results. But often you don't see them in the short term. They are not easily achievable, and they're often not very visible. So a lot of philanthropy in South Africa funds scholarships and more charitable type of giving. It's much more identifiable. You know, you see a person, you put them through university, they come out at the end with a degree and they get a job. Social justice funding and social justice work in general is not like that. We often get results, they're spectacular, they often happen spectacularly at the Constitutional Court, and everyone celebrates, and of course either the government doesn't do anything about it, they don't implement, or yeah, I mean it's blatant kind of lawlessness in some ways, but it's also changes from government policy to government policy, and it's just the results are just not sustained enough. And I believe the other thing that we need to do as philanthropies is to communicate our results better, because they are there, as I said, and we need to focus on advocacy around that with other philanthropies. This has been something that I have worked on for the last 15 years, and I can't say I have been very successful. I do also think that there is a need to challenge the state, of course, to create a more enabling environment for philanthropy. Because as I said, there is a threat or a feeling in the background for philanthropies that this is a dangerous space to be funding in. And I think finally, of course, as philanthropies, what we need to be doing is assisting our grantee partners to become more resilient, not just to give them funding, of course. Obviously, the other question you have to ask are, what are the inherent dangers when social justice work is not funded? In our context, that has meant that corruption and mismanagement in the state continues. Institutions of state are undermined, like the courts, the rule of law. Independent media is weakened. And those, of course, who need state support the most will suffer even more than they are already suffering. And of course, when you don't create an environment that is democratic and open, then it's not an attractive investment destination, and it affects the economy, which has a knock-on effect. And then finally, NGOs themselves are weakened, and philanthropy turns to more charitable types of giving. In South Africa, I have to say, though, it's not all bad news. Because I have a kind of 15-year view of this, I do see some progress and some changes. So locally, we have been funding in this field since 2010, and will continue to do so until we close in 2035. The Millennium Trust, another South African philanthropy that comes out of Capitec Bank, partially supports social justice work and has also done so since about 2010. there are quite a lot of South African connected foundations, either South Africans living abroad or individuals living abroad, who fund social justice work in South Africa. That includes the Bertha Foundation and some of Elma Philanthropies. But more recently and more hopefully, I've seen some new players coming in, and this could be, I think we know the expression about, you should never let a crisis go what's the word? Never waste a crisis, thank you. And I think, the Zuma era in South Africa brought a lot of new people into funding the social justice sector. And our ongoing political and social crisis is having the same impact. So for example, Yellowwoods, which is linked to Hollard, which has been funding a little bit in the social justice space for a number of years in terms of the social justice initiative work, has now expressed an interest and has a strategy around funding in social justice. And even more hopeful is the Oppenheimer Memorial Trust, which is substantially bigger than we are, which now has a social justice strategy and is starting to fund quite progressive work in the sector. And I want to end by addressing something that is difficult actually in the philanthropic space, which is the undemocratic nature of philanthropy itself. There is no doubt, and there's no denying that it is not a democratic space, that foundations are often not transparent, not as transparent as they ask their partners to be. And I can go into the reasons and make excuses for why that is, but it is a fact here that philanthropic foundations are shy, maybe, is the most positive word. And how are we trying to kind of change that? We think it's quite important, and these may sound very superficial, but they are kind of within the limits of what we are able to do. We try at all times to try and tip the balance of power. We acknowledge our power. We talk about it a lot. We talk about how to negotiate and navigate the power in the room always. When you walk into the room with Rand, and the needs are enormous. So we've done quite a bit of work on what is called kind of trust-based philanthropy. We also provide core funding, so we don't ask for budgets, we don't ask for projects, we don't even ask for programs, but we want an overview of what you're doing as an organization. We invest in the expertise really of those organizations, so we don't have that in our foundation. But we trust that those that we're funding have the expertise and should be left to do that, to do the work without interference. We try to make applying as accessible as possible. This is by no means a hurdle that we have gotten over. We also find ways as a small office to get as many resources as possible to communities. And there's a very interesting point here, I think, about that, which is that, of course, I think we all agree that money needs to get to communities. That would require me to have about 4 times the amount of staff I have, because the grants that can be assumed in communities are smaller. So we took a decision that we'd have a small office, small core staff, and then we'd make bigger grants. That's a trade-off. There are many different ways of doing this, but we try then to find intermediaries to do that kind of work for us. And finally, I have to say that even although from the outside, philanthropic organizations appear to be pretty unaccountable, and they are, to the beneficiary organisations. They're certainly not totally unaccountable when it comes to the government, because at any minute now, the government can withdraw our PBO status and we would no longer be able to function. And the law is not entirely clear on how they can do that or why they would do it, but they can do it for a variety of reasons. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey. I didn't give more time. When I was presenting at another conference, after my presentation, the chairperson was like, my chairing is biased. So she's like, I always give women more time, a little bit. And I believe in that because for the longest time, imagine not being able to vote for centuries and centuries as a woman. So that 5 minutes will really make up towards those centuries, right? One at a time, one drop at a time. It gets there. Thank you so much, Audrey, for such an insightful presentation and very provocative conversations. I think there was a conversation around the democratic space, whether it is shrinking or it's doing whatever that is shrinking. And I think for my own biasness and for my own background and my belief in the democratic space, democratic space shrinking? I think to some extent it does, but I think I'm also a student of Upper Rai who believes in the deepening of democracy. So the more the democratic space tries to shrink, the more the people who are being suppressed push back. So I believe in that complexity of democracy, that is complicated. It keeps on being negotiated and renegotiated, and then that allows different actors to come in, and as we fill this house today, and this is a question maybe for you later, Audrey. This is me again abusing the mic because of the privilege, and also adding a drop to the centuries. I spoke about your constant effort to tilt the power balance. And I'm wondering, and I understand this context being, in most cases, repressive regimes, the state that is always pushing back and trying to foreclose the space. But what is your take on the power dynamic between the funding organizations and those that are being funded? Where are we locating them in terms of the power dynamics? And obviously this is me talking to the power of the dollar, of the funder, of the donor, and. Without wasting time, I'm going to call Tendai to take on the mic. Thank you.
I'm not so sure where I stand on the centuries-old issues to do with power. Do I also get to benefit? Yeah, it's going to be tough. So my entry point into this discussion, good afternoon, colleagues. My entry point into this conversation is really from slightly different from what we've been doing. But looking at it, we've struggled with the use of the term civil society. So we've just gone into a very loose term that we use, which is citizenship, just citizens. And we're focusing mostly on what citizens do with each other. That's because that's where actually all these issues come up, that space in between your family and maybe government. That's the space that we're looking at. And we've just looked at it as what citizens do with each other. But I think for us, for this conversation, the previous set of speakers have been sort of not wanting to go into sort of solutions. But we're starting off by saying, what should we do? We have had the problem. I think it's been framed very well. But the question is, what should we do? How does it implicate all of us? So in it, I think for us to even to develop the concept of citizenship, which is an area actually even academics sort of shy away from. Academics in political science and democratic studies focus more on the state than on what citizens do, because it's very difficult to follow what citizens do and to track that. So it's easier to understand states and state behavior. So for us, when we're looking at democracy, on the one hand, we see it as a part of public problem solving, citizens coming together to solve public problems, because that's the original sort of concept around democracy. Before we narrowed it down to elections, etc., it is a broader sociological concept about people coming into the public space. So we have a couple of projects that we do around this that sort of we use to track what citizens do. So the framing, if you move in, the framing is the work of citizens with each other, for each other, and what do they establish. That's our framing in terms of trying to understand citizenship on the continent, etc. And there are also contestations around, does citizenship play out in different contexts? Do we have citizens in the rural areas as we have in the urban areas? But given the 7 minutes I have, I don't think I will go into that one. But I just want to then, let's move on. So for us, what we do, don't look at, just look at the orange, sort of the ones that are colored in orange, which is my favorite color. So we have 3 ways of trying to understand citizenship, because that's how complex it is. We have what we call the African Citizenship Index. Then we have what we call the African Agora. Then we have what we call this ease of doing philanthropy, the challenges of regulation, etc. But I think we need to start off from the African Citizenship Index itself, because here we're trying to measure citizen to citizen intensity of engagement across countries, how citizens are actually in associational forms engaged with each other. So we try to track this in 5 countries, Malawi, Kenya, Ghana, Cameroon, and Zimbabwe. We're trying to understand the intensity of citizen-to-citizen interactions. Before we go to the law, we just want to understand the level, the state of play, and in different spaces, in the economic space, in the political space, in the cultural space, and try to track that. Then let's move on. And we also appreciate that when we're talking about this, let's move on. When we're talking about this phenomena, we are literally talking about the various expressions of then what you're calling civil society, what emerges from citizen-to-citizen interactions. Some form social movements, others go on to establish trade unions, etc. So you have different ways or expressions of how citizens actually coming together. And they give names to these associational forms that they establish. And this is just a listing of a few of them. Then I would like to skip the next slide. And then so that I can move on to an overview of some of the things that we have learned. Yeah, this is where we are. So our study, when we're looking from the Agora being a Greek term for the public space, we're focusing mostly on 12 SADC countries, Southern Africa. And we found 63 laws that either restrict the work of CSOs or threaten their existence. So that's like 5.2 per country, right? So NGOs, all those associations I meant, they have to navigate around these 63 laws. And many new laws are being drafted. We noticed that in 2022 alone, Malawi had a new law, Zimbabwe has a new law, Mozambique has a new law. I'm not so sure if it has been passed. So Botswana also has a new law. So as we speak, many new laws are being passed. And they serve to threaten the sort of what you may call formal civil society. Those are the challenges that they are facing. Let's move on. My 7 minutes will pass. Then financial regulations. I think this is in response to the Financial Action Task Force. We're beginning to see more and more an increase in financial regulations that are targeted at how fundraising is conducted, the movement of philanthropic funds from either crossing borders, but also trying to understand the purpose of those funds. Initially, so this has been happening for the past decade or so. It's a major movement that it actually constrains or limits the kind of funding you can access. Because for certain types of activities that you may want to carry out, you may actually need a government permit first. This is in Tanzania. We've seen it in Zambia, but the Zambian law has been suspended. So it's very important to understand those threats, to say there are certain types then of civil society or certain areas of thematic focus within civil society that are under threat. So it's not a wall blanket, but there are certain spaces that are affected. Let's move on. I think I'm left with very few minutes. So just in 1 year alone, we're looking at this in the last 2 years. That's Malawi, that's Namibia. Zimbabwe is still proposed. It has not yet come to pass. Zimbabwe actually, in the absence of this threat, actually has got some of the most relaxed laws, because tomorrow you can wake up as an NGO in Zimbabwe. If you establish a trust, 2 or 3, establish a trust, go to a lawyer, you have your deed of trust, you have an NGO, you can open a bank account, you can fundraise. That's how we established Civio Institute. Within 5 days, we had an organization. So I think, again, in terms of what you see on paper and what you see in practice are always different things. I want to quickly move on to the African Citizenship Index, because for us, citizenship, you know, when Professor Fowler gave us that slide and said, illegal immigrants, because I think half the time we loosely use the term, or we rigidly use the term to say citizenship is about maybe the passport you hold, the nationality you hold. I think it's just about nationality, because citizenship really is being subject to civic laws. That's all it is. And citizenship, besides from a legalistic perspective, sociologically, citizens are those who are coming together to solve public problems together. So this is one of the things that we've found missing in our democracy, because in our democracy, we've emphasized elections too much, and we have not emphasized other public problem-solving roles of citizens in their collective capacities. So the moment we say citizens, we then begin to ask questions in the multiple. We're no longer saying, what shall I do? Or we do not ask the Leninist question, which is, what must be done? But we begin to say, what should be done? Because we appreciate the fact that we are all implicated in the problems that we're facing as a society. So let me just give you some of our findings around citizenship, the engagement of citizens in the public space. Harare scores very low. We're tracking cities here. Well, at least if you look at Lilongwe and Accra, they score the highest, 70%, telling you of the intensity of citizen activities in the public space. But if you look at Malawi, at the time we carried out the survey, there had been animated sort of protests around the removal of the government and protesting for new elections. So there's been an animation with the public space. So if you look at the conglomerate of different laws that are in a country, they affect the level of intensity of citizen activities. So before we just list the laws, we try to track to say, what effect do these laws have? And the citizenship index helps us a bit in terms to understand the impact of those laws, not just narrowly around fundraising, but actually around the activities of citizens themselves. So if you move on to the next slide. Then the third component, you can move on. The third component, I'm trying to rush. She's not joking when she says I got 7 minutes. Yeah. So the third leg of this is, I think Professor Fowler introduced this. How then do we resource the work that is being done in what we are calling citizen spaces or civil society? That's when we talk about philanthropy. That's when we begin to talk about the regulation of that philanthropy, the challenges of philanthropy. I always say when we talk about philanthropy, we need to understand it in two streams. There's African philanthropy, then there's philanthropy in Africa, talking of two different phenomena. Philanthropy in Africa is everyone else who comes to fund in Africa. They may not be subject to the same regulations and rules as those who are doing African philanthropy. So when we begin to do that, what we're measuring here, we're actually measuring African philanthropy. The locals, how they perceive of the operating environment in terms of pushing their communitarian, sort of community-based initiatives. This is how the countries score. Malawi scores best, I think, compared to many of the other countries. But look at the laws that they have to deal with. 75 unique laws that affect philanthropy in the SADC. So if we're really talking about the interaction between civic space, philanthropy, and the law, these are the challenges that we're facing to say, what should we do about these laws? Is there possibilities of coming up with a harmonized framework, best practice guidelines, or also just to say a SADC guidelines framework for conducting philanthropy? Because SADC, despite the fact it's got a pillar for resource mobilization, is yet to acknowledge philanthropy that is done by common people, peer-to-peer giving, as a pillar of development. It is yet to recognize that. Because when talking about domestic resource mobilization, they're talking about big funds, big funds, not what we give to each other. Then, so there's a proposal for a peer-regulated agora. May you move to that one? Where we're looking at saying, how do we promote a citizen-centered democratic process that deepens solidarity and inclusive development? The citizenship index has already shown us we have a challenge. Agora has shown us that we have a challenge. The ease of doing philanthropy has shown us that we have a challenge. But how do we come together? What should we do? How do we come together to begin to influence? Because there's a gap at SADC. They're yet to realize these challenges or to put them in the manner that we are putting them here together to say it's a comprehensive challenge in terms of human development and also the movement of our people and the actualization of democracy. So if we begin to post these as saying, these are the major threats to democracy, but if you allow us to come up with peer-based or peer-led guidelines, we may actually develop a better framework for civil society freedoms, inclusive of philanthropic freedom. the conversations that we are having also need to be very deliberative, because we are appreciating that the challenges that we have had is, Melody said the conversations in Zimbabwe are characterized by being siloed, etc. But also there is a confrontational approach. You know, we differ. Some may come from the human rights school, some may come from what you may call material development school, but we need to find each other, we need to create common ground, because our challenge is we are not speaking to each other. So the means towards achieving democracy are very important. So Habermas and deliberation help us a lot. Then we are also looking for peaceful ways. So here we're inspired by the, why are you laughing, man? So in Gandhi's sense, and leave the ends unjustified. So I think if we focus more on the means, the end itself will be democratic. But the challenge is we're focused on the end without talking about the means. So half the time we actually find ourselves in a pugilistic battle between ourselves and governments, or between ourselves and civil society. But if we focus more on how we converse, how we organize, and how we mobilize, and also making sure that whatever we're coming up with is a peaceful, non-violent movement. So our inspiration comes from those centers, you know, the Gandhi movement, and also the civil rights movement in the US, and also Ostrom talking about local, then also the manner of discourse being deliberative, that we are coming together to find common solutions to common problems, which is actually the essence of democracy. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Tendai. Just to let you know that you stole 1 minute from humanity, but it's okay, we will forgive you for that. Thank you so much for that conversation, and I like how you are disrupting the whole idea of the notion of national citizenship, speaking largely around the idea of democratic citizenship that I consider as very important in terms of the making and unmaking of the spaces that we occupy. And this is a very special and important form of citizenship that actually speaks to the everyday ways of navigating space and how we come together as citizens to mobilize, but also to reproduce the spaces that we occupy in the everyday. And also abusing the mic again, just throwing this provocation to you. What do we make of this particular citizenship? We've disrupted the national citizenship, and we've moved to the democratic citizenship. But then this is the same form of citizenship that will create, mobilize, and deploy different identities for the purpose of excluding others while including themselves within the space. And this is, in most cases, it is shaped by the state itself. In some cases, it is shaped by different religions, different background. But at the center of that is the scarcity of resources and everything. So what do we make of that citizenship that then tends to mobilize particular identities to exclude others for the purpose of including the other? Thank you. I'll pass the mic to our next speaker. Thank you so
much. Thank you so much, Madam Moderator, and thank you for to CAPSI for the invitation. My name is Liberty Bebe, I think as already said. I come from an organization called the Southern Africa Alliance on Youth Employment. It's an alliance that is focused on advocating policies and actions that promote youth employment and entrepreneurship within the SADC region. Most of what I had wanted to say has been said since morning. So I will try and be brief. I know I will take less than 5 minutes. And I will donate the rest of my time to the panel. Let me begin by saying, I think having listened to the conversations this morning, I'm more tempted to speak largely from a practitioner's perspective. rather than from an intellectual and academic perspective, or from a research perspective. And speaking from a practitioner's perspective, I think what I've noted is that the relationship between governments, civil society, private sector, and philanthropy has always been marked with tensions, conflicts, negotiations, and compromise. I think I will not go into the attempts to define the state, civil society. I think that has already been done. But what we have known is that, or what I have heard since morning, is that we consider the state as some kind of ultimate authority. And we see civil society as some kind of expression of citizen participation, or what Tendai calls citizenship, or an expression of citizen involvement. And we see philanthropy as the driving force behind this change. So this is how I frame my presentation. And I also understand that these sectors do not exist in isolation to each other. They actually interact, intersect, and influence each other in a number of ways. Therefore, navigating this complex relationship requires this understanding of the different roles, responsibilities, and challenges, as well as a recognition of the potential for collaboration and synergy. So as we look at this relationship, I will zero in largely on what civil society has done within contexts that have been largely restrictive, and how they have navigated this relationship. I think we notice that while the state is the primary duty bearer, or has, as the primary duty bearer, has the obligation to ensure that all citizens can enjoy rights and have access to basic services and opportunities. The state cannot do this on its own. We therefore see the role of civil society and philanthropy as essential in complementing and challenging the state in providing services and advocacy that enhance public welfare. And the relationship in that context, we find that the relationship between the state, civil society, and philanthropy in Africa has been largely multifaceted and influenced by a large number of factors, or a wide range of factors, which I think in the morning we heard through SIPO, which are historical legacies, political ideologies, economic conditions, as well as the nature and the form of the state. While some African governments, maybe, I think using the index, I think that we saw, and also what Tenai has given us, and also the conversation from Civicus, we've seen that some African governments have tended to embrace civil society as partners in development, but in partners in development and democratic consolidation, yet there are others who view them as a threat to their authorities, to their authority. And as a result of this, we see a shrinking of this space. And we see this in countries like Zimbabwe, in countries like Eswatini, countries like Lesotho, Sierra Leone, where the shrinking of the space has created challenges in the building of relationships between the state and civil society. And in some instances, we've seen governments trying to co-opt civil society or creating their own civil society organizations, and then going ahead to invite them to their own created spaces. And this has resulted in civil society that is state-aligned, civil society that is furthering the agenda of the state, and civil society that is divorced from the work, or that is divorced from the agenda of citizens themselves. And in Zimbabwe and Eswatini and some parts of Nigeria, we see civil society organizations are viewed as enemies of the state. And we've seen this through what I think colleagues have already spoken about. We've seen the enactment of laws, the instrumentalization of laws, the victimization of civil society actors. We've seen the use of recommendations of the Financial Action Task Force to create laws. You know, the NGO or the Private Voluntary Organizations Act or bill in Zimbabwe is enacted under this disguise of addressing the growing global concerns around money laundering and terrorist financing within the SADC region. So we are seeing the instrumentalization of global frameworks to restrict civil society. So to restrict, spaces for operation by civil society organizations. And for me, part of the critical question is then, what then is the role of philanthropy in all this? We note that donor funding has undoubtedly bolstered civil society in activity in Africa, and the relationship between civil society or external funding has played a significant role in sustaining and enabling the activities of civil society to operate, in a sense, independently while they are advocating for social justice. International donors and philanthropic organizations have provided financial resource, technical expertise, capacity building to African civil society as a way of enhancing their ability to engage with the state and tackle pressing social issues. Through such support, civil society has been empowered and strengthened to function as, again, in inverted commas, as autonomous institutions of checks and balances against the state, which in a way has enabled the opening up, even in authoritarian context, of what we call the democratic space or the participatory space or spaces for citizenship. However, the other side of the relationship between donors and civil society, which I think colleagues have tried to deal with, is that it creates some kind of sense of over-reliance on external funding, which is in a way affecting both sustainability, independence, and the capacity for civil society to influence. I think we've seen this with the emergence of, when there was a shift within the international donor frame from, developmental financing to project-based financing, and the introduction of requests for proposals, which basically push civil society to respond to specific calls for proposals that are driven by specific objectives, and also push civil society to respond to particular interests of international donors. And this has kind of affected the autonomy of civil society and its ability to demand and question donors, and also to demand a space where they can influence authorities. By this, we have seen civil society responding to the interests of foreign governments rather than the interests of local communities. I think let me kind of stop here. I'm told I've finished my time.
Thank you so much, Liberty, and for finishing your 5 minutes and taking more. Yes. Also interesting conversations around I love the overall approach on the issues that have been subject of discussion in the room from the morning and in the everyday. Especially the idea around your questioning of the civil society that has solved the agenda by aligning with the state. I'm going to be unfair to you because you presented on a topic that I'm passionate about, but also you come from an organization that does the work that I'm passionate about. So I'm going to pose 2 questions for you. The one question is around what we're presenting on the civil society that has aligned with the state. And some of the arguments that have been out there, and this is really an honest and an important conversation that we should have, and especially when we look at trade unions and some of the work that they've done and how they've sold out centuries and centuries again of the revolutionary work of the masses by then aligning with the state and therefore with capital and then selling out the agenda. But sometimes some argue that it's necessary, like even within the feminist movement, to align with the state. Because number one, most of the donors, those with big monies and all, they've withdrawn the money from funding any work that speaks to issues of gender, sexuality, and other different identities. But also, secondly, at some point you need to engage at a policy level. And policies, in most cases, they shift at a government state level. So what are some of the ways that are there that we can use to build these relationships, alliances, without necessarily selling off the agenda? The second question is, it's got nothing to do with what you presented, but throwing it to you because you come from an organization that does some of the work that I'm passionate about youth employment, and especially speaking about decent work. In the past couple of years here in South Africa, we've seen the fallist movements, roads must fall, fees must fall, with young people at the forefront of these questions, really asking critical questions about the fallacy of democracies that we're acting on, and about the mystification of the dreams that were sold by the state. But also recently in 2021, we've had the July unrest. One of my favorite Aikale moments, when they say it was a looting, I say it was in Aikale because what we had Aikale, and then the next day, Zakala. So my analysis, and I guess everyone who watched the visuals would agree that young people in their numbers were on the streets doing what was then called to be quote-unquote looting. How do then, my question to you is, how do then young people challenge some of these issues without necessarily, because they all received so much criticism, both, from the government, but also from civil society at large, to say some of the strategies that we've employed, they do not work. They're undermining the democracy, quote-unquote, fought so hard. But also at the same time, maybe a Fanonian scholar would argue violence for violence. So how do young people, question these spaces and also disrupt power without necessarily lending themselves into different forms of critique that they found themselves in? Thank you. Our panelists online? Okay. So we're going to move to our final panelist online. That's Professor Mazen. I think you'll be joining us. I think he's now ready. I believe so.
Yes, Prof. Hello, can you hear me? Hello? Can you please tell me if you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yes, we can. Okay, thank you so much.
Yes.
Well, I have an echo coming back. I make for sure that I'm from Morocco and South Africa is very far away. But well, I think that the technology should be fixed as soon as possible so that you can hear me comfortably. So, yes, thank you so much. So this is Professor Mohsin Al-Ahmadi from the Qadi Iyad University of Marrakesh in Morocco. And today I'll be talking to civil society from Morocco. I have an echo, which is a little bit disturbing. Yes. Okay. So let's start by talking about the civil society in the Moroccan context. And you know that Morocco is an African country, North African country, specifically an Arab country and a Muslim country, and all these levels are, should be taken into consideration when reflecting on philanthropy in the Moroccan context. So please, can you move to the next slide?
Can you hold on for a minute while we try to sort out the echo?
Okay.
Okay, Prof, you can continue.
Okay, sure. So the dynamics of states and civil society in Morocco can be approached in terms of vulnerability, relationship with political parties, relationship with the states, and for sure, philanthropy and donations. So let's move to the next slide, please. So in terms of vulnerability of civil society within the Moroccan context, its initial context of organizations lacked autonomy from the political struggle of parties, unions, and so on and so forth. So organizations saw difficulty in creating and implementing change without direct affiliation to major influential political parties, and future for organization tied to intellectual circles, universities, philanthropy, independent of or from the political party system. Okay, can you move, please? So Morocco's 2022 Global Philanthropy Environment Index showed that legal forms of philanthropic organizations included in the law, and 5 main social issues addressed by these organizations in terms of housing, economic development, human rights, resources, and social justice. So the average time established by law to register a philanthropic organization takes 31 up to 60 days, which is considered as a quite a bit long period of time. So the average cost for registering a philanthropic organization may reach 20 US dollars, which is a little bit costly regarding the Moroccan income, individual income. Also, the government levels primarily regulating the incorporation of philanthropic organizations, and this is the job of the central government, and that's why it seems to be taking much more time. So relationship with the states penetration into civil society discourse, limiting the amount of donations due, as it has been said in the Mozambique context, due to the terrorist actions and also to the terrorist threats. So politically, the state would like to be neutral and have a neutral stance on civil society issues. So the protection of rights through 2011 Constitution have been made on the basis of a political deal regarding the social acceptance of donations and receiving international funds. So and that seems to be very telling. So the philanthropic environment scores, as it has been done by the Indiana University Lilly Family School of Philanthropy in 2022, and my goal in this research is to update these data as of 2023 and also the coming year if possible. So the one get back please to can you get back? So the first one is of operating an philanthropy organization, and you have the index for 2022 compared to 2018. Second, tax incentives referred as 2 in both years. 3, cross-border philanthropic flows. 4, political environment. 5, economic environment. And 6, social or socio-cultural environment. And to finish with the 7 refers to the overall score. Thank you for moving. So formation, registration, operations, dissolution of a philanthropic organization in Morocco. So the 3 indicator questions in this section pertains to the laws and regulations governing philanthropic organizations. And the scoring questions for this category cover the 3 aspects of regulations: formation, registration, operations, and dissolution. So the question 1 is said like, to what extent can individuals form and incorporate the organizations as defined? So the associations of civil society and non-governmental organizations are constituted and exercise their activities in total freedom within respect for constitution and for the law. They may not be dissolved or suspended by the public powers except by virtue of judicial decisions. So I'm just reading the Article 12 of the Morocco's 2011 Constitution. So the second question that rises up after the reading of this article is, to what extent are POs free to operate without excessive government interference? Please. So the outcome of the General Secretariat of Government here in Morocco for the year 2020, which is the ministry in charge of providing licenses for public charities and declaration of funds received from foreign donors, included that this ministry granted 13 licenses to seek public charity in order to collect donations from the public. And it receives up to 885 statements about aid from foreign agencies, which were submitted by 2 or almost 300 associations. So the question 3 that raised up after this statement, to what extent is there government discretion in shutting down these organizations? Please. So laws and penalties. Associations and organizations may not be dissolved or suspended by the public powers except by virtue of a decision of justice. Can you hear me now without echo?
Yes.
Hello? Okay, thank you. So, every association that carries out an activity other than the activity stipulated in its basis laws can be dissolved according to the procedures stipulated in Article 7, and the association's leaders are punished with a fine ranging between 1,200 dirhams up to 5,000 dirhams, about 130 US dollar up to $560, regardless of the penalties prescribed in the criminal legislation. So this is the Article 36 of Law of Associations. So domestic tax and fiscal issues, the two questions in this section are pertaining to laws and regulations regarding the fiscal constraints of giving and receiving donations domestically. So question 4, to what extent is the tax system favorable to making charitable donations? And question 5, to what extent is the tax system favorable to POs in receiving charitable donations? So I have to say that I have not yet, interviewed some organizations to have a feedback, but this is the next step of my research and my field research. So cross-border philanthropic flows, the two questions in this section concerns law and regulations governing the fiscal constraints of giving and receiving cross-border donations coming from Moroccan diaspora, Moroccan immigrants worldwide, or from international institutions. So the scoring of these questions pertains to the donor and receiving entities. So that the question 6 may be asked within this context is, to what extent is the legal regulatory environment favorable to sending cross-border donations? Can you move up, please? So question 7, to what extent is the legal regulatory environment favorable to receiving cross-border donations? Problem with echo. Can you hear me now, please? Hello? So, question 7, to what extent is the legal regulatory environment favorable to receiving cross-border donations? So the association law require in Article 32 that all associations that receive foreign aid must declare this to the General Secretary of Government with the determination of the sums collected and their source within a period of 30 full days from the date of receiving the aid. So this could be read in the Moroccan context in light of the terrorist legislation that took place after 9/11, but also after the May 16th attack, terrorist attacks in Morocco. So the political environment, the 4 indicator questions in the next 3 sections concern the political context, economic conditions, and social cultural characteristics that influence the environment for philanthropy. So question 8, to what extent is the political environment favorable for philanthropy? So the association's interest in public matters and the non-governmental organizations contribute within the framework of participative democracy to enactment, the implementation and the evaluation of the decision and the initiatives of the elected institutions and of the public powers. So these institutions and powers must organize this contribution in accordance with the conditions and modalities established by the law. So I'm referring here to Article 12 of Morocco 2011 Constitution. And here comes the question 9 related to these restrictions. To what extent are public policies and practices favorable for philanthropy? Can you move, please? Can you please move on? Thank you. No. Yes. So political environments, the government has established a partnership portal with civil society organizations, which is a national portal that aims to contribute to strengthening the governance and transparency of public funding directed to the programs, projects, and activities of civil society associations in the Kingdom of Morocco. So it also aims to promote transparency and equal opportunities among civil society organizations in gaining access to all data and information related to public supports and partnerships, establish the principle of competitiveness between projects and the programs of associations in obtaining public support and partnership, and enhance trust between states, institutions, and associations. So economic environment is determined by, or has been determined by, the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's why Morocco experienced economic difficulties due to COVID-19. But despite this, civil society has shown great contributions to this pandemic. Many associations carried out important activities, including submitting proposals on how to deal with the COVID-19 pandemic and organizing awareness-raising activities about the seriousness of this pandemic. So question that rise up from this statement is that, to what extent is the economic context favorable for philanthropy within the actual Moroccan context? Can you move on, please? So the social cultural environment, the question 11 pertains to understand to what extent are social cultural values and practices favorable for philanthropy. So community values help support charitable activities, and society views philanthropy as useful and important for addressing societal problems. And I would like here to just refer to some Arabic and Islamic notions of philanthropy, like al-ihsan, which is charity, and also like zakat, which is the alms, and sadaqah, giving. So these should be highlighted within the Moroccan context, just to show the influence of religion on the conception of these environments. Can you move on, please? So perspectives on philanthropy in Morocco. So all these questions that have been asked are used to provide a general picture of the future of philanthropy in this country, as well as recommendations to improve the philanthropic environment. So current state of philanthropic sector should be described in the state of the art, as started before, and the development of civil society in Morocco has witnessed a significant increase considering the 2011 constitution, as well as in light of the experience gained by civil society in working at the level of project development or participation, in addition to government's tendency to make civil society a partner in general policies at the national or local level. Can you move on, please?
You have a minute to wrap up, please.
Can you go ahead? Hello? Can you move on, please?
Hope you have a minute to wrap up the conversation.
Can you move on, please? Okay, so if you, okay, good. So current states of the philanthropic sector. So three major recent events affecting the philanthropic landscape in Morocco between January 2018 and December 2020. And these are, tendencies are still on the road after 2020. Namely 2001 and 2022. So delay in amending and changing association laws, absence of the new legislations that are compatible with developments in civil society, such as the volunteer law and foundation law, and the COVID-19 pandemic. Please. Yes, so to finish with, I have to say that more civic participation in the public involvement, especially in light of governmental work on preparing a set of draft laws related to the work of associations at the financial level, establishments and volunteering, and also the professionalism shown by associations in dealing with the pandemic and their ability to use the means of communication in activities and mobilization. And I think I'm done. So to finish with this, as I said, amending the laws, insurance of volunteering law and the law of institutions, and to simplify the procedures for establishing associations. Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk to you, all of you. So.
Don't bite my head. It wasn't me, it was technology. Technology doesn't like us, and ironically, it is one of those important infrastructures to navigate the civic space and to form transnational networks, but it doesn't like us. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to pose further questions to Prof, but I will open up to the floor. We've had very provocative and interesting conversations from the panelists, and now I'm opening up to colleagues, fellow comrades, to raise your hands and engage. And while they respond, please also factor in my questions. But we will move the mic. Can we please have a roving mic? There is a hand there. 1, 2, 3. We've got 3 hands.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is Johnny Muteba. I'm from the Pan-African Chamber of Commerce. The question is to Liberty, because he was speaking about the Alliance for Youth Employment within the region. The question I have is, how have you been able to navigate the space in terms of giving opportunities to migrants and refugee students in South Africa? I'm asking that question basically because the Pan-African Chamber as an organization was born in 2010 at an event organized at Wits University, where students who are called international students from across the continent were speaking about the challenges of finding work experience in South Africa. And we know that there's a number of students from Zambia, Zimbabwe, the DRC in South Africa. So when an intervention like Jobs for Youth in Africa came, we did raise issues with the African Development Bank, where they would give money to governments to provide job opportunities for the youth. But it's a government of South Africa that will not think of a student from Zimbabwe or Nigeria in South Africa. So how have you been able to navigate the space? That's the first question. Secondly, what role do you think, if any, entrepreneurship can play in addressing youth unemployment in the region? Yeah, that's kind of enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. My name is Prince. Tendai, I wanted to ask on the citizenship as defining, I think it is defining the we, the people, and all of that that there was a conversation before about. So my question is centered around the issue of the rigid definition, which is that there are people, especially in countries like South Africa and many others. Of course, you're starting not focus on those countries, where you find that there are refugees, there are migrants, and there are people like that. And then the question, then the that definition of people who are in the civil society space, it becomes very important, especially when you put it as citizenship, because now we are asking ourselves, because I think you had a very long slide, but you sort of jumped over it. So it left me particularly unsettled about it, because I want to understand what does it mean? Who now belongs to the civil society outside the formal citizenship of an ID? In Zimbabwe, there are people with IDs that say they are aliens because they were from Malawi and other countries. So I want to understand now. I think we're going back to who is we, who are the people, who are the actors that are in the civil society space. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, colleagues. In the interest of time, time is a very elusive concept. So always we don't have time, we run out of time. So because we've run out of time, to our lunch time, some of the conversations we're going to take them to lunch, but I'm going to give our panelists 1.5 minutes each to respond to questions and wrap up. Thank you.
Okay. So I think the only question was around power dynamics between those funded and the funders. And I mean, it is an age-old challenge for both sides, actually, interestingly, I think. But I think in a world where money is king, it has become inevitable that those with money will have power. And it's therefore incumbent on those who have the power to do whatever they can do to address the imbalance. But what I would say also is that I think it's really important to engage the power of money. And I'm interested actually to know, apart from OSA, if there are any other private foundations in the room with money, because my feeling is that we talk in silos also. I talk to a lot of philanthropic foundations a lot actually through IPASA or in the social justice funding space. I'm wondering if you have those conversations with them often enough, and if that challenge is not engaged with more brutally as it needs to be, because partly foundations with money who are never challenged, they don't engage with that issue. They continue to dominate and dictate the conversation and the terms of the agreements and arrangements with the people they fund. And I think it's time for those conversations to be had honestly in the room. I'm very happy to have them. I'm very aware of my power. I am an introvert by birth, it seems, and but I know that being an introvert with power all of a sudden turns you into someone who feels like an extrovert. And so I think it's incumbent upon both sides to actually, both parts of this, or the many parts of this, to come together and actually say, because you have the money, you have the power. Are you aware of that, and are you aware of how you're using it? Because I think also it's incumbent upon people who don't have the power to come up and say, we have the agency, we have the expertise, we have what you need in order to make your money work. Let's talk about that. Let's talk about what you would do without us. Because I'm very aware of the fact that having money means nothing if you have nobody to partner with to use it.
Prince, thank you so much. I think I'll hold on to this rigid approach to citizenship. At times we are using citizenship around identification, identity, yeah? To which nationality you belong. But I tend to go to the more traditional usage of the term. Here we're talking about, maybe we may say, non-state actors in our individual capacities. Yeah, we are not elected public officials. We come together as private people and we engage. So when you do that, then the issues of participation, which is where you're going to say maybe it's exclusionary, etc. I think it's just that we do not spend as much time going into those communities, into the migrant communities, into the refugee communities, and to understand the different associational forms and types that are in there, that are actually cohering and solving public problems around their being migrants, their being refugees, etc. The associations that emerge from that. And we begin to see actually that they are forging a certain kind of a democratic order. There's a certain of order that emerges out of voluntary mechanisms that are established by citizens. So that's what I'm referring to say this is what we need to be looking at. So when you go into those sub-economies, those places, we actually will be surprised by what exists. And when we begin to use it in that universal sense, we begin to ask ourselves that in the absence of elections that are held every 5 or 6 years in any country, what else do non-state actors do? The challenge that we have had in platforms like this, we then go into conversations like we're having today around a shrinking space. But in that shrinking space, we're looking at the top tier, the more visible forms of what citizens do. They have website addresses, they have big offices. We miss out on what is happening around maybe the vendor association in Alex Park. What are they doing? What are the challenges they are facing? So you find that the laws that they have to interact with are different from the laws we're talking about, because there are laws that they're having to interact with could be actually the vending laws, yeah, the laws to do with freedom of movement during COVID-19, to go and order, etc. So we begin to actually open it up a bit more than just looking at laws to say, oh, laws to do with fundraising for NGOX, because the NGOs also, this space I think many people have not been using, but we need class analysis. It's a highly differentiated space. So who exactly are we, this we question. So once we begin to understand those tiers, those different hierarchies within civil society, we actually begin to realize that we are yet to scratch the surface around the conversations that we're having. Because at times we identify national laws as the ones that are barriers, while there are also municipality laws that are actually affecting local activity on the ground. So I think we need to sort of be able to open up that discussion a bit. But once we have begun to use citizenship in a more relaxed manner than the way we're using it, especially I regretted it because I came into South Africa with your contestations around who is a citizen and who is not, yada, yada, and used it this way without properly explaining it. So it lends itself to these challenges to say who belongs in South Africa and who doesn't belong. So I appreciate that, because everywhere else where we used it, we have not had these challenges like you guys have.
Thank you so much. So I have two questions from the moderator, which actually are layered in different ways. So my understanding is that your question was asking about civil society and the alignment with the state, and then it goes on to single out trade unions, and then there's a question of how do we navigate the space. My view is that I think when we go back to the framing of civil society as the space between the state and the family, it becomes problematic when you have civil society organizations that then align with the state, because they then have a compromised agenda. They tend to represent more the views and the role and the agenda of the state, rather than themselves agenda setting the agenda based on the concerns of the constituencies and the communities that they represent, which in a way makes it difficult for them to retain their identity. They become more and more involved with what the state wants. And I think we've seen this with trade unions. And traditionally, I think in South Africa, the South Africa example of COSATU, and how it has, always tried to navigate that space, between being an independent trade union movement and also having a seat on the table. And I think a number of times we've seen trade unions trying to navigate that space through negotiation forums, different negotiation forums, and how that has, in a way, compromised how they participate. And then, is it wrong for civil society to get funding from government? I think within mature democracies, we've seen this happen. And with civil society, in a sense, kind of retaining their autonomy. But in fragile democracies and authoritarian spaces, I think this has been problematic because it has really compromised civil society's ability to fight for the rights of the citizen. Youth movements, is protests the way to go? Is it the only way? I don't think so. I think it's one of the ways, and it has worked in situations where there are actually platforms and mechanisms in which beyond the protest you can present your grievances, your agenda and stuff, but it has not necessarily, there are other ways. I think we need to see civil society, youth civil society organizers becoming more organized, creating and inventing their own spaces, inviting state and government to those spaces and beginning to influence the agenda within those spaces. We need to see young civil society activists or young activists shaping and agenda setting. The second question was on migrants, refugees within South Africa and how we work with the Southern Africa Alliance for Youth Employment. For me, it's a space we have not touched on, to be frank, because how we've worked is that we were born out of a marriage of the church, civil society, and trade unions. And at the regional level, we've worked through what is called the Apex Alliance, and then we replicate, that concept at the local level, which automatically means that at the local level we work with organizations that are largely focused on the work that affects local citizens. I think it's a conversation that we can have. Is entrepreneurship a solution? It has been touted as one of the solutions, young people creating jobs and finding solutions to the challenges that they face. But there's a whole lot of conversation around the challenges of youth enterprises. What are the challenges that they face? Why is it that youth enterprises fail within the first 36 months of their existence? What are the challenges that create that, and why then youth entrepreneurship fails to be a lasting solution to the challenges of youth employment? And I think also within the context of the changing nature of work, I think these are conversations we can have even beyond this platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to the panel. Please give them a round of applause. And my apologies to the program director. My sincere apologies. It wasn't me.